Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Hello, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7, 90.3 FM, streaming live, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester, and our program is Community Voices. Australia, like many other Western countries, particularly, say, the UK and America, seem to be going through a long-term building mental health crisis, which is calling for all sorts of systemic changes to our health system, our public health system, and in particular, too, this is a pandemic. Today, we're going to be discussing with our guest, Professor Will Davies, political economy Goldsmiths at the University of London. He's a sociologist and a political economist, and discussing a piece that he's written in the London Review of Books recently called Anticipatory Anxiety, reviewing a very influential piece of work by an American that we'll be discussing. So thank you very much for joining us here on Radio Northern Beaches, Will.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Will, the book we are discussing is by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. So I believe his earlier book was Coddling of the American Mind. Can you just tell us what that book was about and what he was trying to say in that, particularly about campus youth?
Haidt is a psychologist who has, in the past, was a psychologist of moral values and is also interested in how, people identify in terms of different sets of moral values, in particular, the polarization of politics into people who hold liberal values versus those who hold conservative ones. The Coddling of the American Mind, I think, originated in 2018. He began to notice in classrooms and around university campuses that there was greater attention to the perceived harms created by the discussion of controversial topics or the discussion of historical topics that included violence and oppression and colonialism and so on. And that, as he saw it, students had come to try to block out information that they found distressing rather than to engage with it and understand it. I think the book no doubt picked up on something that was real. I mean, it's certainly the case that the question of, things like safe spaces or microaggressions and these kinds of concepts are concepts that have emerged in the 21st century. I think he was quite quick to blame this on particular intellectual traditions of social and cultural theory. But I think it led him to ask questions about the vulnerability of young people today and their psychological, emotional fragility, which I think are questions that are worth asking, because clearly, and I'm an academic, so I come into contact with a lot of students, clearly mental health and anxiety, as I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, I mean, it's uncontroversial to say that this has shot up as a problem amongst young people in, as you said in your introduction, in many countries around the world.
Yes, so as you say, he portrays them, I believe, in your review, to say as unreasonably fragile, and he tends to put this down to what he calls the influence of identity politics, where apparently they display, according to his analysis, feelings of victimhood, and all of this because they're somehow very anxious.
Well, we're talking about two separate issues slightly. I mean,
Right.
there's the question of identity politics, which doesn't necessarily kind of have any particular bearing on anxiety as
Right.
a mental health phenomenon. And then there's the question of diagnosable mental illnesses. I mean, identity politics broadly describes the ways in which, particularly, I mean, it tends to refer to the left, but of course you can talk about identity politics on the right if you like, but the left that has questions of justice, questions of oppression and how to overturn oppression have increasingly particularly since the sort of 1980s, have turned away from questions of class and material inequality towards questions of historical identity, cultural identity, and injustices of misrecognition and exclusion. And that justice from the perspective of identity politics means adequate recognition and inclusion in culture and in all sorts of formal and informal political systems. And so, people on the left have often been quite suspicious of it as well, because it appears to sideline questions of material injustice. So I think Haidt himself, he then makes the link between that and the fragility of young people, that people become over attentive to the harms of language, the politics of language, and this sort of thing.
The concept of anxiety, this is a lead in a sense, because I think he does have a concern even in that book with anxiety, which is, and he does sort of describe it, does he, as an exaggerated fear?
So how does he describe anxiety, or how does he describe...
I've got some words: exaggerated fears of everyday situations that potentially escalate to acute mental illnesses manifesting in all sorts of ways that we know: self-harm, suicidal ideation.
The concept of anxiety is a term that has a long history in philosophy, sociology, psychoanalysis, psychiatry. I think what's happened in the 21st century, which Haidt is trying to focus in on, is that rates of anxiety have started to shoot up. And when I say rates of anxiety, I'm talking about rates of diagnosed anxiety disorders, because anxiety is something that we all feel for various reasons, and often for very healthy reasons. I mean, if you're not capable of feeling anxiety, then you constantly miss planes and this sort of stuff, because it's thanks to anxiety that we're able to focus rather relentlessly on future events, like I must have my passport and I must be at the gate by this time. I mean, it's anxiety that allows you to not miss your plane. So if you were incapable of feeling anxiety, you'd be a complete sort of shambolic wreck, basically. The question is, when does anxiety become a disorder of some kind, or a sort of neurosis, to use the more psychoanalytic language? And I guess what most people would assume, and I think Jonathan Haidt is one of them, is that if you find the idea of instance that we're kind of talking about here, like going to class or speaking in class, if that filled you with a terrible dread that something might be about to go terribly wrong, even to the point where actually you don't go, or you go but you refuse to speak, then you're moving out of the realm of a kind of healthy, what we might call normal anxiety, to something that has become debilitating and has stopped you taking part in everyday life in a kind of fulsome fashion. So now it's the rise of that if you look at the statistics, it's particularly within the last 20 years that this has shot up for young people. And when I say young people, I mean everything from kind of relatively small children up to people in their 30s.
You do, in your piece, discuss the relationship between anxiety and depression is the more common term that we hear in the context here, in Australia at least, about the conditions that are said to lead to this mental, or underlie this mental health crisis that we've got. What is the relevance of this distinction in the context of the discussion we're having?
He doesn't talk about depression. So this is one of the things about these articles in the London Review of Books is it can be rather difficult to distinguish what is a discussion of the book and what is a discussion of, but that's kind of the genre, I'm afraid. So his book is not interested in depression. In fact, he doesn't really make much distinction. He's not that interested even in the category of anxiety, to be quite honest. I mean, it's true that classifications of anxiety disorder, that the statistics have shot up. But if it was depression that was shooting up, I think he would be equal. His argument would probably be the same, basically, because it's about distress and mental health diagnoses. One of the things I'm interested in, I guess, is, there was a huge surge of interest in the concept of depression in the 1980s. And this coincided partly with the medicalization of psychiatry, which meant that concepts such as depression became things that were in the hands of doctors to use, really. Nowadays, if you lose sleep or you lose appetite, you have suicidal ideation, you find life pointless and so on, rather than go and speak to a therapist or a priest or something like that, you might turn to your doctor, your physician, who can prescribe you either some short-term talking therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, or antidepressants. And obviously, antidepressants took off in the 1980s with the launch of Prozac in the late 1980s. And there was a huge interest in, first of all, this massive rise in rates of depression, particularly in the United States, particularly in quite consumerist societies, quite highly unequal societies, such as the United States, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, far less in other societies. But it took off and it generated a lot of noise. Broadly speaking, depression If we can go back much further and think about what does depression mean, but often it means a kind of a deadening sense of responsibility and an inability to act, an inability to kind of to move forward, that the past is kind of weighing too heavily on one, and that you become something that is kind of beyond repair in some sense. Anxiety is a much more kind of future-oriented perspective, that there are all these things in the future that might happen, that there's too much that is kind of up for grabs, too much that is that is possible. There's not enough security, there's not enough certainty, and that the future looks overwhelmingly uncertain and open in some respects. And now, often in clinical terms and in diagnostic terms, those two concepts often don't really get much distinguished from each other. They're often referred to as depression, anxiety, with a hyphen between the two of them. And one reason for that is that often they are comorbid, so that certainly in the rates in the United Kingdom, 50% of the time these diagnoses are found together. And so you get particularly, young people who are suffering from depression and anxiety, and often that, if the anxiety is debilitating and you don't feel able to leave the house or to go to a party or to go to class or whatever it might be, and your life is restricted to living at home and staying online, then that's quite a depressing existence. So you can sort of see how these two things become kind of, snowball in various ways. But the interesting thing is that anxiety has a concept which in the 90s was not a sort of major part of the psychiatric discussion, really did take off, particularly after sort of 2008, that kind of time. And this is one of the things that Haidt is trying to explain.
Yeah, well, thanks for clarifying that. The Anxious Generation, his book, which he describes as the rewiring of childhood, is causing an epidemic of mental illness, particularly among the young, obviously. He puts forward that you discuss two experience blockers that he says basically are what's led to this big increase in young people in lack of mental health and whatever. And he's got two of these blockers, and one of which is he puts down to the culture of parenting and overprotection of children as they grow up, and the second being the rise of smartphones.
He would be grateful for your introduction there, because I know that one of the problems with the book is it was only the second of those two experience blockers that has really kind of taken off as a talking point.
It certainly has here in Australia. We've got legislation.
Smartphone, that's right. Yeah, so I know you've now got the legal change on social media and so on. Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister of the UK, had Jonathan Haidt into 10 Downing Street, and everyone was reading his book, and everyone was just fixated on this issue of smartphones, because I think politicians like, having the idea that there's something that they can do and they can ban, and smartphones and social media accounts, they feel they can do that, whereas they can't suddenly go and dramatically change the way people parent. Quite plausibly, and I think this is something which I think we have to take quite seriously. His argument is that something changed in the 1990s. It's mainly about the United States, but I think there are lessons in it for other countries, which was that parents became suddenly very aware of the dangers lurking in public space broadly, on the street, in the park, and so on. And this was partly to do with the way that, the media was behaving in relation to kind of some high-profile child murders or pedophiles or whatever it might be. And the age at which people were allowed to in America, it's also to do with the kind of rise of litigious culture of blame and focusing on perpetrators and victims and so on in the system of litigation. Leaving identity politics aside, there's a huge focus on victimhood and blame in American culture. This led to the age at which parents were willing to let their children walk to school or to meet up in the park and so on began to rise, and there's good evidence on this happening in the UK as well. The ability of children to just sort of hang out basically diminished. Parents were increasingly trying to kind of structure their children's spare time with a phenomenon. I don't know if Haidt uses this term, but in Britain we've had this concept of schoolification, which refers, I think, quite plausibly to the way in which, I guess it's particularly a sort of middle class, upper middle class thing, that a child's free time gets filled with various kind of lessons and activities and paid for structured activities in which there are adults present. And what Haidt is arguing in his book is that actually situations where children are just working things out amongst themselves and having to judge risk for themselves and having to judge the ambiguities of relationships for themselves and deal with things like hierarchy and informal conversation and occasional getting kind of bruises and bumps and this sort of thing. I mean, he's got a rather gendered distinction between the need for boys to be able to sort of take physical risks and to be able to sort of climb trees. Girls, meanwhile, have to be able to sort of sort out their sort of social differences and their kind of, social hierarchies. And I'm sure he's been taken to task for the rather kind of essentialist view there, although he has rather a kind of biological understanding of psychology. So he would no doubt defend it as such. But if adults are present in those situations and adults are basically laying down the rules and saying this, no matter how in fact, it's totally irrelevant whether the adult is a benevolent one or not. This is basically removing the opportunities for children to learn how to become adults themselves, basically. And that what this is doing is blocking this crucial passage from childhood through to adulthood, that's basically puberty or adolescence. And during that time, all sorts of really complicated things are going on that are actually really constitutive of a healthy kind of adult mind, healthy adult behavior. But that if adults won't get out of the way because they think the world is either too dangerous or that children are incapable of judging risk for themselves and this sort of thing, then that will get blocked. So that's really the first one, is kind of like a over-intrusive parenting and not allowing children the freedom to hang out with other children in public space. Even, in his book, even has photographs of, the way in which playgrounds have changed over time.
Guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches is Will Davies, Professor of Political Economy at Goldsmiths, University of London, and we're talking about the ideas and causes behind what's been called the rewiring of childhood that is causing an epidemic of mental illness. His second point, as we've alluded, is that he thinks smartphones have basically too contributed anyway to this mental anxiety and problem, doesn't he? In part because he says it keeps kids focused on the screen and not focused on play-based activity with others.
The smartphone, iPhone was launched in 2007, but the smartphones really took off between about 2010 and 2015, roughly that sort of time. And he's got graph after graph after graph in his book showing that this was when the children who basically went through puberty during that crucial period, since that period, have exhibited much, much higher rates of mental illness and anxiety disorder than those who went through puberty before then. It's those crucial years between sort of like 12 and 16 that where he thinks a huge amount of potential kind of harm or inhibition is taking place, which is why he would no doubt applaud the Australian decision to lift the rate of social media usage to 16. But the thing about the smartphone, I think, for him is that it's kind of weaponizing certain forms of it's making the outside world seem more dangerous to people. It's interfering again with those sorts of learning activities that happen through face-to-face real-time activity. There are all sorts of complicated reasons why that is, to do with the fact that the exchanges become more asynchronous, so they become non-real time. I think it's particularly focused on girls because we know that girls are heavier users of social media platforms, but also it's girls and young women that are greater sufferers of anxiety disorders. I mean, broadly speaking, again, there's a kind of slight gender reductionism here, but boys are accessing too much violence and porn as they enter this age in their teens and so on. Girls, there's the endless kind of quest for social respectability and status and recognition and so on, that he's kind of, and we know this. I mean, we didn't take Jonathan Haidt to tell us this, because there was the famous Facebook whistleblower who came out and said that Facebook's own internal research on Instagram showed that Instagram usage amongst teenage girls, or particularly younger teenage girls, was leading to self-harm and suicidal ideation and this sort of thing. And basically Facebook buried the research. So, lots of this stuff is not new. I think what's very been quite compelling about this book, it has been particularly these sort of visual representations of how these rates all shot up from about 2010 onwards, which is particularly, that's when the smartphone, I mean, that's when I got a smartphone, was 2010. I mean, that seems to be a year when, there's a lot to be said for I think, he's onto something, and it certainly has provoked, I think, quite a useful conversation.
Although, as you say in your article, you say there's a tendency or possibility here of confusing what we know is a problem in scientific method, the correlation and causation, that in fact, rather than perhaps, for example, the kids' anxiety and everything is actually making them heavier users of phones, they're retreating rather than the other way around. How valid a critique is that of these views he's putting?
I mean, I think it's what scientists are meant to do, is just go and pull apart someone else's data. I'm not a psychologist or a statistician, so this isn't really, I mean, there was one particular, he faced a lot of pushback. I think partly I find some of his sort of political views and his sort of dismissal of certain aspects of campus culture to be rather unwelcome, but at the same time, I'm not someone who's a huge fan of his as a public intellectual, but at the same time, I kind of respect what he's done with this book. I think that there are people in the social sciences who just dislike him kind of on principle, to be honest. And I think he got some pushback from people saying, well, actually, you don't understand that actually the reasons for this anxiety are not what you think they are, and you can't take away kids' smartphones, and you have no idea how important a smartphone is to a child who's, I don't know, sort of suffering in this way, and it gives them a voice.
And we hear it here in this current discussion about the smartphones. You can't take them away. You can't turn back the clock. You're going to hurt kids who are benefiting from it. You can't just go back to the Just William world.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, schools can be a bit more, interventionist, I think. In the UK, it varies hugely. I mean, there's some schools where if you're seen ever with a smoke phone on your person, it'll get confiscated for 2 weeks and that kind of thing. And there are others where kids have got them out the entire time, and that's in the discretion of the school. So I think if he may have launched a useful debate in terms of which of those is a better approach. But on the causation correlation issue, I mean, again, I'm not someone who's gone and studied all these stats in terms of regression analysis and this kind of thing. I think, and no doubt, some of these people have got a point. I think that one of the things that I welcomed in my review about the book was that, we need to have some wider, when there's this much distress in society. I mean, one of the statistics I quote in my piece, which is nothing to do with Jonathan Haidt, it's from the Resolution Foundation, which is the UK think tank, shows that there is now in Britain more people in their 20s claiming disability benefit from the government than there are people in their 40s. So and that is to do with mental and behavioral problems. That's particularly since COVID. But, we think of, the reasons people claim disability benefit to do with, people develop kind of, back problems and mobility problems and this sort of thing as they go through life. But the idea that actually people in their 20s are now a more at-risk group of being outside of the labor market due to health issues, and that is actually to do with mental health problems. This is a really kind of concerning development in our society. And I think it warrants big picture, potentially, not always, narratives that aren't going to necessarily explain every single last case of mental distress. Of course they're not, but they do allow a society to have a conversation as to what is going wrong. Now, you might not accept Jonathan Haidt's answer to that question, but I think he's to be congratulated for at least posing the question as a wider, he's not a sociologist, but he poses it in quite sociological terms as to what is happening at the macro level. Because one of the problems with the medicalization of psychiatry over the last 40 years is that those sorts of questions have no longer been posed in sociological or political terms. They've become things about brain chemistry and behavior and individual, multi-causal analysis and all this sort of stuff. At what point do we ask, where is our society going wrong?
Well, indeed. And our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches is Will Davies, Professor of Political Economy at Goldsmiths, University of London. We're talking about the rewiring of childhood as a possible cause of epidemic in mental illness, particularly among youth. And to pick up on that point of yours, Will, at the end, and I think you make this point for yourself, he looks at these two factors and inhibitors and causes, but he seems to take no account of where society, what's the impact of, as you call them, material factors at work here, class, inequality, economic circumstances, because the data suggests there are correlations and if not causations.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, correlation is a worthy thing to at least kind of bring to light, even if you can't then prove the precise correlate the causal factor. But he doesn't really talk particularly about material factor or inequality or class. But there are other studies that have shown that people living in rental accommodation suffer higher levels of anxiety than people living who are owner occupiers. And I know that Australia, like Britain, is a society that has been sort of like completely dominated by fixation on property ownership and with huge kind of inflated property prices as a result. And this generates all sorts of schisms in society and kind of pathologies of desperate efforts to try to get some kind of housing security and so on. Now, you can ask questions about that because we know that has certain impacts on rates of mental health diagnoses. Equally, if you look at where this isn't about anxiety, this is more about it's sort of adjacent and overlapping categories of depression, but the areas of the UK with the highest rates of antidepressant prescriptions, and this is quite an easy thing to track through our National Health Service, correlate precisely to areas of greatest economic depression and deprivation, areas of the Northwest like Blackpool and this sort of thing. In a way, I think what Haidt's work has rather unhelpfully done is to make some people believe that, all of this distress in our society, particularly amongst young people, is kind of privileged kids go to university and they read a load of Foucault or something, and then suddenly come to the impression that they're a victim and they go and complain to their doctor or something like that. That's the sort of cliche. And certainly the right-wing media is really kind of hammers that kind of narrative. Whereas in fact, actually, a far more kind of typical example would be somebody who is living in insecure accommodation in a deprived part of the country with insecure employment or kind of multiple disabilities and without a strong social safety net. I mean, that is a far more likely recipe for suffering depression and anxiety than, being a kind of hipster in the city who's, spent too much money on avocados on toast or whatever it is that the newspapers are claiming.
Well, indeed, I think you turned a nice phrase, and I think it's yours, where you say that mental health disorders, I guess particularly in youth, is certainly not a symptom of privilege. And in fact,
No, it's not.
that's so borne out here with the statistics, where regional areas with less income security, with less secure home emotional environments,
Yeah.
these are factors that look to be, as importantly, at least related to, if not causing, the incidence of mental health, particularly among young people and women, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, all of that story doesn't really fly with the media. I mean, that's one of the problems is that I think there's a large constituency of newspapers in this country which want to make out that young people are sort of, malingerers and
Yep.
and are sort of like full of self-pity. And actually they don't know what real hardship is because, they didn't live through the war or something like that. People reading these newspapers lived through the war either. But and I think that really kind of clouds the a serious conversation about
Is there a political dimension to all of this discussion and the way that which governments are reacting to it, say typically from the left or the right? Because governments generally, anyway, certainly speaking here, seem to be taking a long time to getting around to tackling these problems that have been growing for a long while, and the scale and urgency of their responses doesn't seem to match the nature of the problem presented in the statistics in reality, does it?
There was I think it's become so we had a change of government in the summer where we now have a Labour government with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister. They have tried to tackle it. It often arises in countries with social and national health systems or forms of social insurance for healthcare. It arises as when it becomes clear that this is putting too much strain on government finances because either it's causing people to spend too much time drawing on the health service, but I think more importantly when people are not able to work and that's putting too much strain on employers or drawing too much on the disability benefit system. And we've had multiple rounds of that in the UK, typically led by Labour governments. I mean, it was the Blair government really, because they saw this as a tackling unemployment agenda. That there was a recognition in the 90s that people who were long-term unemployed, often one of the reasons they didn't go back to work was that basically they were depressed. And that led, through a rather long chain of sort of forms of policy advice, and I cover this in a book I wrote called The Happiness Industry from 2015, led to a massive rollout of cognitive behavioral therapy on our National Health Service as an effort to try to kind of tackle depression as a way of trying to reactivate labour, basically small labour as in workers. We're seeing another version of that under the current Labour government in the UK, where because there is this huge rate of disability claimants, particularly amongst young people, particularly since COVID. And I think there's a view, which I think many people would be sympathetic to. It's not really so sort of culturally inflected as the view of the newspapers. Surely there's something that can be done for these young people beyond just simply giving them more medication or more therapy. That what these young people surely really want is to sort of return to work and return to becoming mainstream members of society. Now, the problem is, what does the government do in order to make that happen? Well, there's always a little bit of carrot and a little bit of stick. And often, as in, so there's some incentives, but there also has to be a little bit of, look, if you don't start trying to get yourself into shape to where you can go back to work and take responsibility for yourself financially, then, eventually we're going to withdraw your disability, or at least if you refuse help, let's say, then we're going to refuse your disability benefits. Now, obviously, that's a very controversial thing to say. It's said sometimes governments are quite happy to trumpet that line because it wins favor with the right-wing newspapers that that they're trying to bring on board. But yeah, there's been some of that going on recently. Of course, it's extremely difficult because often the service providers that are actually tasked with doing it are outsourcing companies, and often they behave in a rather kind of clumsy, sometimes outright cruel fashion, where they're having to assess a young person who says, well, I can't leave the house because I'm agoraphobic, or I can't work because I'm neurodiverse, or whatever it might be. And it requires that those young people need to be treated with some care and some compassion, and often they're not. So then the whole sort of system becomes kind of mired in claims of cruelty and impersonal bureaucracy and so on. So it's a very, very difficult thing for governments to deal with.
These ideas that we've been discussing with our guest here on Radio Northern Beaches, Will Davies, Professor of Political Economy at Goldsmiths University of London. We've been discussing the ideas of the American Sociologist, psychologist Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. And as we've discussed, he puts it down to two main causes, namely helicopter parenting, as we call it, or fearful parenting, and on the other hand, the rise of smartphones. But I think, as we've discussed, there's probably a lot broader material factors in socio and economy that bear equally on these things that need attention and perhaps aren't getting it. And you end your article 2 with a call for, reinvestment in public institutions that will help teenagers and young people discover a sense of autonomy and self-worth in self-environments, which sounds a pretty good place to end up, even if the politics isn't there yet.
Yeah.
Really found it fascinating and instructive to talk with you, and I've certainly enjoyed your article that we've been discussing, Anticipatory Anxiety, in the London Review of Books in June. Thanks very much indeed, Will.
Pleasure.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.